Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the National Climate Risk Assessment. Really great to see so much interest in this topic today, and really excited to share with you some knowledge from expert speakers in the area who I'll introduce later. I'm going to jump right into it. My name is Imogen. I'm the Climate Program Manager at Ironbark Sustainability, and we're really excited to share with you this information. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I'm on the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and just want to acknowledge that there are people joining from all over this wonderful country of ours, and the many, many nations which our country represents. And also just a bit of a shout out to Victorian First Nations people who have managed to get the first treaty passed through state government legislation in the last week or so. So a bit of a milestone for Australia to have a treaty started. Just a little bit about us. We are Ironbark Sustainability. We are a consultancy that works on all things climate and sustainability. We're a small team, but we have a big reach. We work all over Australia, and we love supporting every community and local government on things like risk assessments, on emissions reduction strategies, on street lighting work, and many more. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to race through a few things. A little bit of housekeeping and snapshot updates. For those of you that don't know, Snapshot is a tool we've been producing for many years now. And then we have some speakers on the National Climate Risk Assessment who I'll introduce later, and then speakers from local government and how they're approaching it. We'll have a bit of time for Q&A. It would be great if you can put your questions in the chat, and we will draw from the chat to look at which ones we will pull out. And then we are also happy to stick around at the end. For those of you who need to jump out at 12, feel free. But if you've got additional questions, we're happy to stick around for the end to answer a few more questions. So housekeeping, you're all on mute, but it would be great if you could put your cameras on. It's a lot nicer for us to see who we're speaking to, and a lot nicer for you to be able to see all the happy faces that are joining today. Also just noting that the webinar will be recorded, and we will put it up for public view on our website. So if you'd like to share it or jump in later to reference it, you can do that. And we also have on hand Paul, Managing Director, and Matt, Ironbark's data guru. If you would like to ask questions, they will be answering them as we go as well. Also, a massive shout out to our Snapshot sponsors. We really appreciate your support. Without your contributions, we would not be able to keep Snapshot up and running. So Stonington, Hobart, Augusta Margaret River, Cairns, Whitehorse, Mitchellshire, Unley, Singleton, you are some of the 9 best councils in Australia, if not the world. We really appreciate your support. However, we need a bit more support. We're only getting about half the money that we need to keep Snapshot up and running. So just noting it's a really valuable tool for both councils and their communities. And if you want to keep seeing it free and accessible, please consider chipping in as a sponsor. Any amount is welcome. We appreciate councils are under financial stress, but this resource is a real game changer for councils. So please chip in if you can. Just a little bit about you. We asked a few questions about the National Climate Risk Assessment in the registration form. So most of you said that you think that the risk assessment is critically important. A number of you said that you think it will help you gain internal support. A few of you are not sure, and a few of you are influenced by the information. Just noting that the risk assessment itself was released by the Australian government, and it will impact Australia's economy, infrastructure, communities, and we also asked about risk assessments that you have undertaken. So a lot of you have undertaken risk assessments for your council. That's actually more than I thought would have done this, and a fair few have done some community-wide risk assessments as well. A fair few are planning it. Some are not doing it and not looking at doing it for their community, and others are not sure or would like to do it in future. And again, for adaptation plans, a number of councils have got adaptation plans for their council and a few for their community. Others are looking at doing it but have not yet undertaken it, and others are not sure. And again, all of this fits into Australia's 2035 national target towards reducing emissions. So this was published in September. The target was backed up by work undertaken by the Climate Change Authority and modelling by Treasury. The federal government has come up with a 62 to 70% range target below 2005 levels by 2035. This is part of our obligations under the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. We have to provide nationally determined contributions every 5 years and work towards those global emission targets. It's also linked to a net zero plan for 2035, which looks at pathways across 6 sectors. A lot of these are relevant to local government, particularly electricity and energy, the built environment and transport, and for some councils, agriculture and land use and industry if they're a big player in your particular community. Also, just referring back to the science-derived targets tool that we provide for the local governments, you can jump on and see a science-derived target for either 1.5 or 2 degrees, and this will give you information about the carbon budget, the time remaining annual emissions reduction or annual reduction required to meet those science-derived targets. And I'd encourage you to all take a look in those and see how they could align or support a 2035 target federally. And now to Snapshot. So we have updated Snapshot again for the 23-24 financial year and the 23 calendar year. Australia's total emissions are significant, and this is the task ahead of us. Trying to reduce these emissions in line with the federal government's target is looking at a 60 to 70% reduction within the next 10 years or so. It's a big task, and every local government in Australia makes up a piece of this pie, so everyone has a role to play in getting there. Nationally, emissions are trending down, but not really that speedily. The change in the last few years has been pretty minimal, and a lot of the heavy lifting has been done in the electricity sector, and other sectors are becoming more significant. So, for example, in Newcastle, electricity emissions are still quite a high proportion of the total, and a lot of that is through industrial electricity use, and then also IPPU, industrial processes, is a significant component. But in other councils, like Hume in Victoria, electricity use has dropped down, but transport is becoming a major component of the emissions profile. There's a lot of work to do in terms of public transport infrastructure and collaboration between local, state and federal agencies to implement effective transport infrastructure. Other places like Port Pirie, the profile is dominated by industrial processes. There is one of the largest smelters in the world in Port Pirie, so most of their emissions come from processing a whole range of metals. So quite a different task. And then other communities like Banana in Queensland, agriculture is the biggest component of their emissions profile. So just really highlighting that there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach for local governments in terms of reducing their emissions. And then some communities like Jerramungup in Western Australia has a small total emissions, but that is dominated by agriculture as well. Just again to point out that the Local Government Climate Review, which was published last year, refers to the nationally determined contributions and the huge potential that local governments have to play in both liaising with their local stakeholders and implementing federal plans. There's a lot of work to be done to get that bottom-up recommendations that the Climate Change Authority is suggesting around acknowledging local government as a key partner in delivery of national sector plans. And also just to shout out that local governments are already delivering projects on the ground, and that Australian councils themselves make up about 1.5% of Australia's total emissions, but 86% of the councils we surveyed already have emissions inventories or plans to reduce those emissions, and that most of those targets are in line with the 2030 zero emissions target, which also aligns with federal government agencies' targets. And again, across the community, councils can play a really key role in meeting emissions reductions. We think that they can facilitate about 15% emissions reductions across the community. Now onto the National Climate Risk Assessment itself. I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Dr Andrew Watkins, who is a climate scientist renowned for his really clear communication and efforts to help people make the best decisions to reduce their risk. He's worked at BOM for many years on both weather and climate, and with the UN Climate Risk Early Warning System program, and he led the delivery of the climate science component of Australia's first ever National Climate Risk Assessment. We're really honoured to have your insights today, and I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Imogen, and my apologies for being in a bit of a dark room. Don't know what my camera's doing there. Yeah, thanks everyone. So as Imogen just said, the National Climate Risk Assessment has been basically a very quick 2-year assessment of the risk for Australia. And I'll go through how we worked on that. I was a lead author of the risk assessment overall, but as Imogen said, my primary focus was on the climate science part. So next slide, please, Imogen. So first of all, what is climate risk? And many of us just immediately think about the hazard, the bushfire or the flood or the storm and so on that might hit us. But what makes this assessment for the government different from others is that we actually went into, well, who's vulnerable to this? It might be, where are the elderly people, or people, lower socio-economic areas, or people without cars or an escape from the hazard. And what's exposed to the risks? What's exposed to those fires and floods and so on? The exposure is looking at things like, electricity networks or supply chains and so on. So what's exposed to the hazard? And then finally, what response are we doing? So what has been put in place already? And the intersection of all these things is really the risk that we have to deal with and hopefully reduce if we can. Really quickly, a quick assessment over 2 years. I've just seen the comment there. Really overseas, the Americans, they're up to their 6th one, the UK up to their 4th. So they take 4 or 5 years to do these things. 2 years is pretty quick. So next slide, please. And so, how did we do this? Ultimately, it was funded by the federal government, of course, and it involved the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, the Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and Geosciences Australia. But there were also multiple collaborations with universities, states and territories, systems experts, and other government agencies like Treasury and so on. We didn't really get down in great depth into local government areas, but there were some umbrella organisations. I've forgotten the name for the one in far north Queensland. Some umbrella organisations that look after multiple local government areas were involved. But ultimately, we spoke to well over 2,000 participants, probably closer to 2,500. We had over 250 lead authors involved in the report. And it was quite, incredibly dense, and probably the hardest thing I've ever worked on. But it certainly went as much as possible to go out and talk to stakeholders rather than just talking to scientists. And I think that's really important. And in terms of having longer to do it, that probably would be one of the key things we do. Next slide. Now, this basically shows that, well, first of all, the bit on the left, some of this is quite confronting. It's okay. That it is confronting information. So please, take it on board that this, when you go into the report, it can be distressing at times. Look, we looked at things not in terms of necessarily in the final reports in terms of just the hazards. We looked at the different systems that are important to Australia. In reference to local government areas and so on, communities was one of the key ones that we looked at. And we assessed the risk currently and then out at 2050. And we did do some assessment at 2090 as well, going out into the future. So really we're just looking at the rest of this century. And you can see that basically we're not at low on any of these key systems. We're currently at sort of moderate to high on most. And then by 2050, we're looking at high, very high or severe risk in basically all these systems that are of importance to Australia and, of course, important to local government as well. Things such as the natural environment concern me because the natural environment sits under primary industries and food. We looked at some additional things like water security and so on as well, sort of subparts of these systems. And again, nothing really is currently at low, and nothing is really below high at 2050. So a lot of concerns there, and there's a lot more detail. There's technical reports on all of these in the National Climate Risk Assessment. Next slide, please. So just looking at one thing, so just looking at one part of one of those systems, looking at health. And we looked at things such as the number of severe and extreme heat wave days. Currently, around Australia, we typically have how we would classify them. We currently have about 4 severe extreme heat wave days per year at the global warming level of 1.2 degrees. That's what we're currently at, about 1.2. But if we go through the rest of the century, and if the globe hits 1.5 or 2 or 3 degrees, we looked at how many heat wave days we might get. And if we allow the globe to get to 3 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, we could see an additional 14 days of extreme heat across Australia. So that's an additional. So that would mean we'd have 18 days per year of extreme heat compared to roughly about 4 at the moment. So that's a quadrupling in days of severe heat. You can see that's more impacted on the maps on the right in northern Australia, a little bit less in the south, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't get extremes, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Parts of northern Australia could become potentially unlivable if we get high humidity as well, though we need to be very careful with using words like that because, of course, First Nations people have been living in areas for a long time, and they are very connected to the country, so it has special impacts upon them. Next slide, please. So, of course, that was the average weather, but if we go and look at some case studies, and what we did here is that we looked at Black Saturday from 2009, where the heat wave immediately prior to it, we unfortunately had around 400 lives lost. And you can see the maps on the right-hand side. You can see areas that were above 46 and even just little areas above 48 degrees. But if we take those weather systems and transplant them into a 3-degree global warming climate, we basically end up with something like the bottom 2 maps, where we see catastrophic fire danger over a massive area in New South Wales, South Australia, and Victoria as well. But those grey areas show that temperatures above 48 degrees are in a massive area over southeastern Australia and even into the Northern Territory and Queensland as well. So there'd be massive areas, and probably something like 4 times the area of catastrophic fire danger, and also catastrophic temperatures as well. And you might see a little bit of even greyish colour down there in Gippsland. There is the potential for places even in Gippsland that we think of nice and green and cool of getting up around 50 degrees in these sorts of scenarios. And that's entirely plausible. The models are just like your weather models that we use for the forecast we see on the TV each day. Next slide, please. We can also take into account that exposure and vulnerability, and the risk assessment did some work looking at who's exposed or who and what is exposed and who is vulnerable to extreme heat. And we come up and also where we actually have some response. And so we came up with maps such as these ones for heat health. And you can see the map on the left basically showing the blue areas that have the least heat health risk, and those red areas that have the most. So there are pockets, even of somewhere such as Melbourne, which is relatively well protected from heat health. There are pockets where we have extreme heat health risk in those areas. And so some of those local government areas need support from the federal or state levels and so on to look at how they can increase the response actions and decrease that red on the maps. Next one. And we have fairly high confidence in these maps, I should say. And so that health focus, you know, these extremes will impact physical, but also mental health, particularly with younger children and so on. We're seeing that. But also some of the most vulnerable communities include those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people I mentioned, but also people with pre-existing health conditions. The other problems for inland areas, you know, attracting healthcare workers will become increasingly hard, and you know, we might see, of course, without healthcare workers or midwives and so on, might be extremely difficult for people that are already at risk, such as people giving birth and so on. Also, deaths from increased disease transmission are likely to rise. We could see tropical diseases in areas we've never seen them before. And I guess that final point about heat-related deaths, you know, we're looking at a quadrupling potentially at 3 degrees global warming for even for places like Sydney, and particularly areas such as Western Sydney are most at risk. So that's a really quick snapshot of just heat health, just in the that health and wellbeing system that we talked about. And I think that might have been it for me, Imogen.
Yeah, I just might mention that there is some resources that Andrew provided that gives you a complete list of all of the different components of the report. So if there's any particular area you're interested in, you can go to that reference and jump straight into the report that's of most interest to you. It's a big document, but it has been designed in a way that you can jump into the areas that are relevant to you relatively easily. So I wouldn't suggest sitting down and trying to read it all at once, but if you are interested in health, for example, looking at the health chapter is a good way to approach it. Thanks heaps, Andrew. We might jump next to our next speaker, but if you have questions specifically for Andrew, please put them into the chat. We will answer them as we go, or we will have time to answer them a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Judith Bruinsma. Judith is the acting CEO of the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils and a leader in developing practical solutions on climate. She's renowned for guiding complex multi-stakeholder projects on urban heat, climate resilience, emissions reduction and sustainability. And I'm going to hand over to Judith to talk about her work on heat resilience across the Western Sydney area.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Imogen, and thanks, IMBUC, for inviting me to speak today. And also thank you, Andrew, for setting the scene so very well. That was fantastic. Yeah, so today I really wanted to focus on some of the tools and resources we've developed as WSROC over the past 10 years. So for those of you who don't know us, WSROC's the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. We work with councils in Western Sydney, and like Andrew already flagged, heat is a massive issue for us, for our councils and for our communities. Everything that I'll run through today is freely available on our website and free to use. I'm always happy to answer questions. Next slide, Imogen. So what I know Andrew touched upon this already in terms of the impact of heat. We are also working quite closely with cities across the world. So heat is not just an issue for Australia. It is something that a lot of countries are currently grappling with. It is an emerging issue. Everyone is looking at what the best ways are to respond, to adapt to heat and heat wave. We all know that heat impacts all parts of the system. And again, I think the risk assessment that Andrew touched upon is doing a really good job at sort of looking at the different sectors that are impacted. A lot of our communities are now starting to also tell us how they're impacted by heat. So it is definitely something that we find is very much on the radar of our local communities as well. Next slide. So when we started to work on heat, the heat was very much an issue that was raised by our councils pretty much in 2016. Talking about solutions to heat, we kind of went around in circles initially a little bit. Like, are we trying to reduce temperatures? Are we trying to protect people, keep them safe? We of course want to do all of that, but they require different solutions. So for us, it's been quite useful to start to unpack sort of what for us heat encapsulates. And for us, while interlinked, these three separate components, understanding these allow us to really better identify appropriate solutions as well. So thinking through climate change impacts and sort of how we can address those, urban heat islands, so how the urban environment sort of traps and re-radiates heats, and thinking about sort of how urban design can mitigate those impacts. So thinking through material choices, trees, water, and so forth. But then we also have heat waves. So we also really want to know how we can make sure that our people are safe when those outdoor temperatures are getting really extreme. And I also no amount of trees that we're planting is necessarily going to protect people. We also really need to think about how to make sure that people can stay safe, that we've got the systems in place to respond if things go really wrong. Next slide. So again, we've been working on heat since about 2016. WSROC has all the work that we do is very much in partnership with stakeholders. So we work very closely, of course, with our councils, but we also work very, very closely with our research stakeholders, our communities, and our industry stakeholders to develop tools and resources that apply to sort of place-based locations and that are really grounded in practice. Next slide. So a lot of the work we've been doing has been on sort of the urban planning and design in that area. There's three sort of projects that I've listed here on this slide, and they all try to tackle sort of a different issue within sort of urban planning and design. So the first document on the left-hand side that you can see there is our Urban Heat Planning Toolkit, which provides guidance to councils on developing planning policy. So this is currently very widely used by our councils, but also by state agencies. Future-proofing residential development. So the second document is a study that we did together with UNSW, that really looks at building design and really sort of interrogates sort of NEDAs and National Construction Code standards. And it really shows that we're using outdated climate data, that we're not really considering thermal safety in homes. And this document, together with some other studies that we're aware of, have been really instrumental in advocating for changes to NEDAs. This is very much a work in progress, though. Cool Suburbs is an online rating and assessment tool for heat resilience in urban design. So that's, again, free to use. Coolsuburbs.au was developed with a science panel, but also with industry. It's currently quite heavily used by councils, but also developers for, and it can be used at different skills. So master planning stage as well as building design. On that website, you can see quite a few resources as well as case studies on how Cool Suburbs has been used. I will also say that those resources, everything that we do, if that is of interest, all of those documents, all of those resources generally contain a very clear narrative about what the issue of heat is, how it can be addressed, and thus quote very strongly the latest research in this space as well. So next slide. I'll skip this slide because I've talked a bit about how our work has been used. So next slide, please. So we've also done a bit of work on heatwave preparedness and response. This is something that is very much also an emerging issue for many of our councils. So on the left-hand side, you can see a suite of community-focused preparedness materials that we've developed. So that includes social media, resources, videos, pamphlets, and it also includes translated materials. I think we've got it in 10 different languages. These are used by councils, but also by our local health districts and community organizations, and they've been really, really popular. Heatwave management guide. I think this is the one that I really wanted to flag today with the group. So this is the middle image. This is a resource that we developed the last couple of years, and we released it, I think, early this year or late last year. This really provides guidance on how councils can address heat wave throughout their whole sort of operations. So it includes a lot of case studies, tips, guidance, and resources for councils to sort of really think about addressing heat wave through risk assessment. So there's a chapter on risk assessments. So that's particularly, I think, relevant to the group and the conversation today. through strategic planning, council operations, cool places, community resilience, communications, and emergency management. We know that all of those parts of councils have a role to play when it comes to heat wave management. So this is quite a rich tool that tries to sort of identify what's already happening and where opportunities might lie. And again, the heat wave risk assessment section in this document is quite useful, we found, to really understand sort of what different heat wave risk assessments are already in place. What can they be used for? What information, what data is useful to assess what type of risk, because they are all useful for, but potentially for different purposes. So it's really good to be aware of that. Next slide. Sorry, can I skip this one? So a lot of what we've been doing over the past few years is really understanding the governance for heat. So we know that managing heat is very much a shared responsibility. You can see that on that wheel there. If we need to make changes in all of these sectors, we really need a coordinated approach. We know that there's been amazing work happening across Australia when it comes to heat and heat wave adaptation and mitigation, but it's really time to start to sort of coordinate and scale up, particularly when you saw sort of the risk that's like that growing risk that Andrew also presented on. So that's why WSROC worked with a lot of stakeholders across particularly Greater Sydney to develop the Heat Smart City Plan. So yeah, thanks, Imogen. Next slide, please. We established the Greater Sydney Heat Task Force, which consists of experts and decision makers from local, states, federal governments, community, industry and research sectors. Together with all of those stakeholders, the task force designed the Heat Smart City Plan, which really outlines an agreed approach to coordinating action for heat resilience. So next slide. So this is what the plan looks like. You can download it from our website. It has quite rich sort of information, but we hope we've made it quite digestible as well. If you go to the next slide, Imogen. So the plan outlines 40 recommendations for implementation. You can see sort of a summary of all of those recommendations here. In the plan, you'll find that each of those recommendations has more detail attached to it. They also include a lead facilitator. So again, this is a shared responsibility. So we've got the Department of Planning, we've got the New South Wales Health, we've got councils. They all sort of have identified areas in like recommendations in this plan that they want to lead for implementation. Implementation is a massive feat, as you can imagine. So we're set to implement from 2025, so this year, first year, up to 2030. While a lot of work, well, it's a real challenge and a lot of work still needing to be done, I am like really excited that even this year we've seen movement on 30 out of the 40 recommendations. I also will note that the city plan, it has been referenced in the National Adaptation Plan as well, and our task force members have provided input into the National Climate Risk Assessment as well. So next slide. I think that's it from me. So that was me running through really quickly. There's a lot of information in each of these resources. Again, I just hope they're useful. I know they were developed for our councils in Western Sydney and Greater Western Sydney, but a lot of the information in there is absolutely transferable to other parts of Australia as well. We have an e-news. If you look at the QR code there, we've started that this year. That doesn't just entail, like, we are not just reporting on what we are doing as WSROC, but we're really sourcing information from all of our stakeholders so that people can keep abreast of developments when it comes to heat resilience. So if you go to that QR code, you can see sort of past publications as well and see if that's of interest for you. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Judith. That is an amazing wealth of resources that I'd recommend councils take a look at. And again, a key opportunity here is to not reinvent the wheel, but use resources that already exist to leapfrog and progress action across your council. Again, pop your questions in the chat and we will do our best to answer them as we go. And now I'm going to introduce our next guest speaker is Jack Kensey from Hawkesbury City Council. Jack is the Environmental Sustainability Coordinator at Hawkesbury, and he is here to share his insights on the Hawkesbury Climate Risk Assessment the Adaptation Action Plan, and Thriving Hawkesbury Beyond Resilience Strategy. Thanks so much for jumping in today, Jack.
Thanks, Imogen. Just going to go through a couple of the different things that Council's been working on in terms of climate change. So the first is the Climate Change Risk Assessment and Adaptation Action Plan. If you want to go next slide. And next slide again. So the main reason for all of, the main driver for all of the works that's happening at Council is because Hawkesbury is experiencing climate change practically. It's not something that, you know, is theoretical for us. It's something that we're experiencing firsthand. We've had droughts, we've had extreme heat waves, we've got up to 50 degrees almost. We've had catastrophic bushfires, we've had severe storms and floods. It's something that's happening more and more, and it's not extraordinary anymore. It's actually the ordinary that we're getting impacted so much. So we've really got to find ways of adapting and addressing the fact that this is our new reality. Next slide. So the first document, strategy off the rank, was the Climate Risk Assessment Adaptation Action Plan. And the important thing for this was it was specifically focused on council service delivery. So there was an intention, it was very intentional to split council service delivery from community climate change. One of those reasons is political. At the time that this was being developed, it was flagged that some of our elected maybe don't believe in climate change, and that it wouldn't be an easy task to get through something to do with the community. And so we focused on council service delivery and tried to take as much as an objective and evidence-based approach as possible, which worked quite well. So it has a whole council scope. It's whole of council implementation, and it did undertake a formal climate risk assessment, which has been great for council, and it's good at normalising that process. Next slide. So part of that was actually understanding what climate risk is. People are probably quite familiar with this in local government now, but you know, it's not just about the hazards and what we experience, it's also about what's exposed and what's vulnerable. So next slide. And this diagram, it's a bit complex, but really what it's saying is that there's hazards that are raised by climate change, and these are the things that are going to get affected in council. So these are the things that council's vulnerable to, these are the things that council's exposed to, and that's going to lead to reduced or impacted community outcomes and impacted council service delivery. So rationally, logically, that means we need to adapt. Next slide. So there's a whole range of different actions that come from this plan, and happy to announce that all of them are in progress, which is great. But there was some key measures around relocation of council services, decentralisation of some council services such as customer service, so having pop-ups, etc. A really, really critical one is the improvement of organisational governance and planning and processes, and the focus on partnerships, our roles as a local government in supporting, facilitating, and that look to improve green and blue infrastructure, which is quite important as well. Next slide. So just keep in mind that that climate risk assessment adaptation action plan in the back of your mind for after the Thriving Hawkesbury Beyond Resilience, because it all ties together into what we've been actually doing, embedding it into council later on. So the Thriving Hawkesbury Beyond Resilience is our new strategy. It was adopted 14th of October, and it looks at resilience from a very holistic perspective. So it's not looking at just because there's disasters we need to be resilient. It's actually noticing that everything is interconnected. We have other strategies that are talking about sustainability and resilience and economic development, and it's all interconnected together. There's also that realisation and that growing awareness, not just in the Hawkesbury. It's definitely a sentiment in the Hawkesbury, but you know, right across Sydney, right across the globe, that resilience isn't enough. No one actually just wants to be resilient. Everyone wants to be thriving. Everyone wants to go beyond resilience. It's not enough to just survive. People want to be thriving and prosper. So that's really the target of this strategy. And what the strategy calls for is strategic cohesion and alignment right across council, right across our IP&R, which is really, really important, because that means it's going to influence decision making at the elected council level, and also at the executive level. Next. So it introduces a theory of change, which is a newbie for council. We haven't really done too much theory of changes, and credit to Resilient Sydney, because it looks very similar to the theory of change that's within Resilient Sydney, but with a Hawkesbury flavour. So, and to be honest, that is extremely intentional in the document to align closely with regional strategies like the heat plan that Judith was just talking about, but also Resilient Sydney's strategy. So there is that, global, national, state, regional, local alignment. So it is quite intentional as well. But that strategic logic is extremely important, and I advocate it strongly for anyone in local government, because that's how you bring the council along for the rational ride, for the logic ride. That's how you get them to make sense of it all, and how to get them arguing not in the weeds on the details, but on the actual things that you want them to discuss, the logic, the rationale, the outcomes. Next. So some of the key considerations in this document are that it establishes a whole vision for the entire community. It's not just council's vision. This is a shared vision for the entire community, all stakeholders included. And it aligns extremely closely to our CSP. So the reason for that very intentional and close alignment is it strengthens both the CSP and its value, but also the document in terms of its ability to access DPOP, so delivery program and operational planning budgeting. And the way that it does that, this document, is that in the action plan, it's not actually saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to fund this. What it says is this is what we're currently doing. This is what is grant funded, and these are unfunded opportunities. These are opportunities to do more and to get better outcomes, but currently don't have a source of funding right now, which is important for influencing that decision making, and also in not overcommitting to things that we just can't commit to. Next. And so, as I mentioned, it's not just about resilience in the strategy. Well, it's all about resilience. It's all about going beyond, but that means that you have to introduce the whole sustainability gamut. So social wellbeing, social cohesion, economic development, environmental outcomes. And so that's where it starts getting that cohesion and that ability to really align the whole of council strategy. It does go beyond preemptive response to disasters, but it starts articulating around the inextricable links between how we live and where we live. The best example I always give for the Hawkesbury, for people to understand, is we have a big river, and that river determines whether or not we have bridges. It determines whether or not we can do waste collection. It determines whether or not we have water for agriculture. It is a reality that our environment affects how we live, and how we live affects the environment. How we behave affects the river. So it's really easy to understand. It's really tangible, but it's really an important concept for resilience, but sustainability more broadly. And that aspect of going beyond resilience. So turning that understanding of that inextricable links, but making that impactful, making that actually make sense, make action, make impact, and recognizing where we are in control, where we're only able to influence, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. So next slide. So they're kind of strategic documents, but we have undertaken a project which was collaborated with Sustainability Advantage to embed sustainability risk more into our enterprise risk management framework. And that's important because of that need, that action highlighted in the climate risk assessment adaptation action plan, but also because of the thriving Hawkesbury Beyond Resilience strategy to really have impactful real change. A lot of risk assessment and enterprise risk management frameworks are really poor at capturing sustainability risk. And that's because traditional risk management doesn't consider really long timeframes. It's supposed to, but humans are terrible at it. So we need to really consciously make sure we're considering long timeframes. We're not the only stakeholder, we're not in control. So risk management, we like to focus on what we can control, but we need to start implementing what we can influence as well. And highlighting that there's some things we can't control and we're just concerned about them. And then looking at the risk management framework in a way that's going to create real change beyond, just the sustainability team trying to drive risk, and we're not only just talking about climate change. Climate change is a big component of that, but sustainability risk in general. Next. So that series of control becomes very, very important. And I feel like it's extremely important to be articulating this to the elected body and to the executives as well, because we don't want to be spending money where we're going to get no impact. That is a waste. And we'd have lots of waste. So let's redivert resources to where we can control, where we can influence, and let's call that out and say, hey, councillors, hey, community, we know you're worried about this, but we can't control it. We can barely influence it. So let's put our money where we can actually have impact. And that's a really core concern around risk management, but also strategy as well. Next. So if anyone has dived into their enterprise risk management framework, they look similarly to this. You have a risk statement. There's a convention on how you devise a risk statement. So you've got to follow that. But to take a step back, the project got together a brains trust of all the different various managers from council or their representatives to do a workshop and just throw out ideas, put it on a, brainstorm, creative juices flowing, putting stickers and papers and stuff everywhere around what they think is a sustainability risk after a bit of education around what sustainability is and what risk is. And so all of their ideas were collected, and then myself and the governance risk team sat down together and nutted out, okay, what are some risk statements that address all of these issues? And so we devised a risk statement. We imagined what some of those risk management ideas could be, but that's an important part that the stakeholder needs to be involved with. We looked at who the risk owner would be and who the risk contributors would be. So we're not just saying, right, the risk owner is one person and one person only. That's not reality. They need support from other business units in council. And then we sat down individually and as groups with those risk contributors and those risk owners to look at the risk management options and see if they were actually effective and actually going to be impactful. So if you go to the next slide. So what it ends up being is you look at the triple risk. So you look at the risk as it would be with no management whatsoever. You look at the risk with the existing controls, and then you look at the risk with your proposed controls. And so the diagram there is realistically saying, if you've got really high risk in the current situation and your risk management creates much lower risk, then that gives you huge justification for doing those management actions. And if your management actions aren't lowering the risk, what's the point? Don't invest money into actions that don't lower risk. And so that is a really fiscally responsible governance trick to get support for your actions by articulating how your strategic actions are going to lower your risk. And some of the things that have come out of this, if you go next slide, is councils all have an ARIC and a CRIP. So more acronyms for everyone. So an ARIC is an Audit Risk and Improvement Committee. There's legislation that says that we have to have one of those. And we also have CRIPs, which are continuous risk improvement plans. Ours is done by our insurer, so Civic Mutual. And they're cyclical, so they go about every 3 years or so. They get audited. And actually independent. So the sustainability risk project identified some actions, of course, and the CRIP identifies some actions independently. But when those two things align, it's like gold because they must be done. And if they don't get done, then we're not managing our risk properly. So one of the things that got identified in the risk improvement project was to develop a sustainability policy. And I know, again, it's not climate change specifically, but it's strongly related. And the CRIP has also said we need roles and responsibilities. We need clear definitions and clear commitment from governance and organisation around these things. And we need a sustainability policy. And so that's kind of eye-opening for me, because that was never an action that I had proposed. It was never something that the sustainability team wanted to do. But it emerged from the projects and emerged from risk management that this was something that needs to be done so that we can do it well, we can do it effectively. And so that, it's not just me at council doing sustainability, it's everyone at council doing sustainability and everyone at council doing climate management. And so really advocate for some of those practical things to move forward. I think that's it. Next slide. Yep, Q&A.
Thanks so much, Jack. It looks like a whole wealth of work has gone into those resources across community, and I really like your thinking around, doing actions that will make a difference on the ground. A few key questions from the registration page. There were sort of three main themes around those questions. One was around connecting local government action with state and federal government. Wondering, Andrew, if you have anything, any advice or recommendations you can speak to on that.
Ooh, if I take myself off mute. Look, I've put in the chat that the ENCRA really is looking at the very high level at federal government. That's who we had to satisfy effectively. But in doing so, all the information, and I've put in the chat a few times that the data itself isn't available yet, but it will be coming out at I think it's 5K resolution for most of it. So it will be in a form that can be used by local governments to drill down into their local risk using a nationally consistent framework. And so also, I think when we look at the report itself, it's very important that people assess, first of all, I think go out and talk to people and what is concerning them and what industry is critical and so forth. And then go into the report and go, okay, well, I'm a coastal community. I have a large First Nations population, etc. I have some particularly vulnerable people and elderly people or so on. And then look at those parts of the report that actually can be useful to you to give a guide on what things to focus on and where to go from there. But I think that community consultation at the local level is absolutely critical, and using the ENCRA as a guide on what some of the questions might be to talk about is probably the best use of it at this stage. And then eventually, hopefully fairly soon, the data will come out at that higher resolution that can then be put into your own documents.
Another key... Oh, sorry, did you want to jump in, Judith? Sorry. Another key theme from some of the questions in the jot form were around resourcing, and that councils are already very stretched in delivering their current services. And this is a sort of additional task on the work that they're doing. Maybe, Judith, can you talk a little bit to working as a region and making the best use of collaboration across the region and how that can help alleviate some of that resourcing pressure?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, that's the whole point of doing regional collaboration. Exactly like you said, Imogen, initially, like, don't reinvent the wheel. I think I've seen a few comments as well about even resources for regional councils, which is a very, very valid point. I know that in our cities, we tend to spit out quite a bit of work. Potentially there might be a bit more resourcing attached to what we're doing, but being able to share that with other councils and for you to sort of look at what others have done and sort of make that your own can be incredibly useful. I know some regional councils are doing amazing work on obviously climate risk assessment, but also on heat wave management. So there's certainly examples and case studies out there that you can use. I just wanted to also make the point about the previous point in terms of aligning federal, state and local government in this space. I think there is still a way for us to go in terms of the governance arrangements around that, making sure that we sort of that what Andrew and team and everyone is doing is absolutely fantastic, and we at local level can use it to guide what we're doing, but vice versa, we also need to sort of have those sort of two-way streams of information going backwards and forwards as well. And that's something that we're certainly very much aware of, and that's something that we're looking to improve moving forward through some of our work as well.
There are a few questions specifically for Jack in the chat. So Jack, I might get you to answer them in the chat if you can. We've only got a few minutes left and I've got a few more resources to share. So I'm going to jump ahead. Just to reiterate that councils are at risk from climate change. There are physical risks, there are insurance risks, there are litigation risks, but you can make a good defence. Transparent and sound decision-making, governance arrangements, reporting and data limitation disclaimers are a good way for all councils to go. Also reiterating that councils are leaders in this space. They have been working on reducing risk across their communities, specifically in climate change for decades now, both across operations, reducing and tracking their emissions, setting up mitigation projects, voluntary reporting and undertaking council risk assessments. There are a lot more councils that have done those than I had initially thought in that initial jot form registration. Also that councils are champions at collaboration and advocacy, and that working across teams and partnerships with other councils, with ROCs, JOs, alliances and the like, you're really good at that work. And I think other levels of government have a lot to learn from you on how to do that better. And that also you are champions at community resilience and supporting your community through difficult times and providing those services and support. So really iterating the important work that all councils do to support their communities and manage this risk. This was probably the biggest question that came through, is like, what are the actions that we can take? Here are a few recommendations. There's probably a lot more that you could do, but using the National Climate Risk Assessment to advocate internally for council action and getting climate change embedded across your normal risk processes. Sharing information honestly with your community about the risks that are coming and the uncertainty around those risks, so that how you want to tackle those decisions that do definitely have a big impact upon the community. Joining forces with councils in your region, looking at undertaking regional risk assessments as a first pass to get going, and considering climate risk through your existing council risk processes. Another really key important part is, I think, that collaborative advocacy to both state and federal government for consistent reporting mandates and processes for councils to follow, so that you're not all figuring it out on your own. And effective resourcing to deliver it is a really key next step too. I don't know if this is good news or bad news, but this is the current assessment of what the nationally determined contributions globally lead to. So we've currently sort of tipped into the 1.2 to 1.5 degree change since pre-industrial temperatures. And this leads to, with the current pledges that we have, it sort of leads towards a just under 2 degrees scenario by the end of the century, but with quite an uncertainty band around that. So possibly looking up to 2.9 degrees warming. And, at best case scenario, 1.3 degrees warming. So that's sort of the uncertainty boundaries that we're currently faced with, and councils need to consider whether they want to look at the middle band or the upper bands of those risks and how they tackle them. And also just reiterating that 1.5 degrees warming is a real threat to our Pacific neighbours. We do not yet know whether we'll be hosting the next COP, but if we are, it will probably be a really big opportunity for councils to get their stories out there about the great work that you're currently doing and about scalable programs that could be replicated, not just in Australia, but globally. There are a lot of resources out there that are relevant to councils, and a lot of these are produced by the federal department, but there are others at state level as well. And CROMP, the Climate Risk and Opportunity Management Program, is a resource that can help guide councils through the climate risk process. And there is a community of practice that is hosted by DECU, Federal DECU. If you would like to join that community of practice, you can email the contact below. And also, also there's a webinar this afternoon that ALGA and DECU are hosting, which will talk about the climate risk process for local government as well, probably diving in a little bit more into the detail of the report itself. So jump into that webinar if you'd like to attend. There's also a webinar coming up, which is hosted by Renew Australia for All, which is an advocacy group with about 70 different coalition partners, of which Ironbark is one. And they are also hosting a local government webinar around campaigns and advocacy efforts. They are launching a climate safety plan, and they are looking for partnering with local governments around that advocacy. So again, that webinar is on the 20th of November, and you can jump in via the Teams link, I think we've just put in the chat, or contact Melanie Cutler at EAGA, the Eastern Alliance for Greenhouse Alliance in Victoria. She's coordinating that event. And also, just to iterate, Ironbark has a whole series of webinars on both climate reporting and climate risk. You can access all of those on our website. And spot on the dot of 12 o'clock, that is the end of the formal proceedings. Thank you very much for coming. If you would like to stick around, we'll be here for a little while to answer further questions in a slightly less formal way. Otherwise, great to have you here, and thanks again to all of our speakers. We really appreciate not only your time in attending today, but all of the hard work that has gone into all the resources that you've produced, and sharing those with the community is really valuable, so really appreciate it. Thanks so much.